the new article that came out in Huffington Post about Alan Dyer, who was one of the original signatories of the Goldwater Rule. So there was a great deal of discussion about the Goldwater Rule. Many of you who have followed me over time know that I often bring it up because I feel that that is the original sin of what we are experiencing today when the American Psychiatric Association, at the height of discourse about Donald Trump's mental impairments, at the very beginning of his presidency, when mental health experts were called upon and consulted on news networks, cable TV, other programs constantly, and I was being interviewed 15 hours a day, every single day, we felt that a mental health solution was at hand. And then the American Psychiatric Association, quite artificially and uh, unexpectedly for most who have followed or studied the Goldwater Rule, created a gag order out of it. It was never meant to be one. It was not even a very significant rule. It's not even a rule. And not most psychiatrists did not even know about it because it wasn't taught in residency programs. It wasn't taught in any program that we knew of until Donald Trump became president. And then less than 2 months into his presidency, the APA put out what was called a reaffirmation of the Goldwater Rule, which in fact was a reinterpretation that created a new gag order that potentially violated all core tenets of medical ethics, including our responsibility to society, and the Declaration of Geneva, which uh, requires that mental professional, medical and mental health professionals all adhere to what they were calling the new Hippocratic Oath at that time, uh, a reaffirmation of the humanitarian goals of medicine that superseded any directive by any destructive regime, as happened under Nazi Germany. And it came out of the experience of Nazi Germany itself and the Nuremberg trials. And that's why the new Goldwater Rule was so alarming to many of us. It galvanized my own speaking up about Donald Trump. In fact, I never may have if it had not made this alarming move. And I said at that time that if the American Psychiatric Association was going to prohibit intervention, a sharing of knowledge, and making intervention possible in a proper way in mental health terms for a mental health problem, then all other interventions would fail. And unfortunately, I can back up that assertion now with all that has happened. And so we're now 1.5 weeks out of the next presidential election, the third uh, candidacy for Donald Trump, and he is pretty much neck and neck with his contender, Kamala Harris, despite having 34 indicted and convicted felonies, in spite of having killed the vast majority of 1.2 million American deaths from COVID-19 mismanagement, despite having been the only president to have violently insurrected against the government through a violent mob on January 6, 2021, and who has caused countless other calamities and destabilization of American democracy, destabilization of geopolitical security, and is considerably responsible for the culture of violence and especially political violence that we see today. So essentially the article, many of you will have gotten it through my newsletter, that the Goldwater Rule, instituted in 1973, was crafted out of a political situation. Usually, psychiatric ethics comes out of scholarship and practice, actual clinical practice, not from a political situation. But the Goldwater Rule, as the name suggests, is an exception. Many of you know it came out of Barry Goldwater's candidacy for presidency. Many mental health professionals thought he was an extremist. The KKK at the time endorsed him, and he spoke with a rhetoric that many thought could be apocalyptic or highly destructive. Of course, none of that happened, but also Goldwater never reached the presidency. We know, and we have seen from the example of Donald Trump, that existing mental pathologies augment and transmogrify with power because the normal treatment of dangerous personality disorders and accompanying symptoms is to contain them, to limit their access to power, and to essentially bring external limits to their behavior. They, of course, have this fantasy desire to attain power and to counteract their inner feelings of emptiness, worthlessness, and inadequacy. But giving them unwarranted power is not the solution. In fact, it can cause catastrophic consequences, which we can see in most um, uh, atrocities that have been committed by leaders of countries in history. So Dr. Alan Dyer is the only surviving signatory of the Goldwater Rule. At the time, he didn't oppose it, but he believed always that it was an affirmative obligation, as have I. I also interpreted the Goldwater Rule as an affirmative obligation, that we were supposed to participate in activities that improve the community and better public health. And so it was an educational obligation, fitting with our responsibility to society, which is in one of our primary responsibilities in the preamble of our ethics code. And but it's annotated that when we're asked about a public figure, we should not diagnose unless we have conducted a personal examination and gotten consent to publicize that diagnosis. That doesn't just apply to public figures. In fact, it applies to everybody. It was a given. But to state that, to single out public figures and to state it in the guidelines, and the American Psychiatric Association is the only mental health association that has done this. After they have done it, no other mental health association adopted it. No licensing board was able to adopt it because it goes against our First Amendment rights. And so the APA was alone in inserting this, and many considered that it was a political compromise. It was to appease the Republicans at the time who were pressuring the American Medical Association for the APA to insert this guideline. So, so that's pretty much the history of the Goldwater Rule, that almost didn't matter. Nobody paid attention to it until Donald Trump's presidential campaign. Around 2016, experts in psychiatric ethics put out a pretty authoritative article stating that the Goldwater Rule does not mean you cannot speak about a public figure. In fact, the overarching societal responsibility that we have requires that we speak to the public and continue to educate the public in ways that will not only prevent danger to the public, but also just for betterment of its well-being. And so what the APA did in terms of what I've called a public disinformation campaign, since coming out so severely with the Trump presidency, that what it was doing was contrary to scholarship, contrary to everything we understood about the ethical guidelines, and in my view was perversion of the rule in order to gain political advantage during a time when any scientific organization that did not uh, toe to the line of the administration was being penalized with unprecedented funding cuts. And in fact, there was a study done for the Journal of the American Medical Association that all scientific associations that kept to science lost funding under the Trump administration. So contrast that to the American Psychiatric Association, which received unprecedented windfalls of federal funding and was even able to buy a building in the center of Washington near Capitol Hill. So we can kind of follow the money to trace the reasons for the APA making uh, such an unprecedented move. It had never gone against other public figures, in fact, breaking its own Goldwater rule to speak about public figures it didn't approve of publicly without having examined us or gotten consent from us, and while spreading falsehoods about us. They called us armchair psychiatrists, those who are politicizing psychiatry for self-aggrandizing reasons. Of course, they had no basis for saying any of these things, but it stuck with the public and stuck with the media, especially when it partnered with the New York Times in early 2018, right after Donald Trump spoke about how his nuclear buttons were bigger than Kim Jong-un's nuclear buttons. Interest in our viewpoints just exploded, and we were the #1 topic of national conversation just after our book was a New York Times bestseller. And Congress members were consulting with us as to how to handle this situation. In fact, they were relying on us to educate the public medically so that they could intervene politically. This actually surprised me that they would be so reliant on our own actions, but they felt that they were politically tied because of the polarization between the Republicans and Democrats. And indeed, the Republicans would later, no matter what some of its members thought of Donald Trump being an existential danger to our nation and the world, many retiring senators and representatives from the Republican side have voiced this. So it wasn't a partisan matter, but to suppress mental health and to suppress any discourse in public was a political move on the part of the APA and then a partisan move on the part of the Republicans, which then, of course, the Democrats often followed suit. So in my view, this is the reason we are here. We are where we are today. In my view, the APA had done what it had because it had detected authoritarian leanings in Donald Trump, in our society, and a major move that authoritarians make is to first silence the journalists and the intellectuals. And what mental health experts had to offer was the best available knowledge that we had to offer the public so that it could make informed decisions and to retain its own autonomy and discernment in deciphering what is the truth so that it can make choices accordingly. Same with journalists. Journalists offer facts, critical facts that the public needs to access in order to protect itself and to carry out its own goals. So more than 9 years of the public's lack of access to proper intellectual knowledge and proper journalistic reporting, because historian Timothy Snyder has described this common phenomenon of obeying in advance. We have this almost instinctual survival mechanism built in our primitive brains where we detect that if we were to continue in our way, that we would be targeted and possibly um, threatened and intimidated and possibly um, persecuted if we were to do the right thing under an authoritarian regime. An authoritarian regime is essentially an abusive, violent regime that I have termed um, uh, a condition that happens with mental pathology in politics, which leads to our destruction, the inevitable endpoint of disease. And that it was so important to speak up early. And speaking up early prevents this spread, but many do not speak up at the time of need. And that is how authoritarianism spreads, tyranny spreads because of our obedience in advance. And so that is why, especially why, knowing of these dynamics, that it was important for mental health experts to come forth and speak up, because all of these political consequences and social, cultural, geopolitical consequences start with the dangerous leader, with a dangerous psychology. In fact, I've often described spread of symptoms, just like any spread of infectious disease, what we ordinarily call infectious disease, is that you need three factors. That is an offending agent, the germ or the virus that begins the epidemic or pandemic. But that by itself does not create anything. You know, the tuberculosis uh, uh, organism could not spread unless it had weakened hosts, those whose immune systems have been compromised, and a facilitating environment or conditions such as damp, cramped, enclosed conditions that were rampant in the 19th century that caused such spread of tuberculosis. Now we have the conditions that are set for the spread of mental symptoms. That is our environment uh, of social media, the mass media environment, as well as disinformation, profit-driven disinformation formulas that interfere with the propagation of correct news and correct knowledge. Then we have the weakened hosts, which usually is a society in distress. Of course, weakened hosts are those with developmental wounds themselves. Essentially, a dangerous leader is someone with developmental arrestation at some point, which turns into a disorder. Those in the population with similar developmental wounds will respond with a magnetic attraction to such leaders. That is what I have called narcissistic symbiosis, which begins to facilitate the Trump contagion. And this situation happens, of course, with abusive households, when many adults come from authoritarian households. I've also lately been speaking up about family courts because many people do not know this, but when it breaks, it will be bigger than the Catholic Church scandals. In that the family courts, you know, the divorce rates are high and child custody battles are pretty common. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of children per year are actually being trafficked to their abusers through the family courts. Now, how exactly they do this and cover it up can be discussed at a later time, but this happening over years, if not decades, children are going taken, in fact, abducted from their caring, nurturing parents and environments and being transferred over to their abusers, batterers, rapists, and murderers at the rate of tens, if not hundreds of thousands per year. So that's another issue for another time, but this kind of corruption helps engender weakened hosts. And then the third element is the offending agent, who is the person with severe mental impairments who gains a position of power.